I'd like to welcome everyone. My name is Rebecca Lowe. I'm the Adult Program Coordinator here at the Lewis Public Library. Thank you for joining us this evening, and welcome to our series, Science and Society, Making Sense of the World Around Us. This lecture series is co-organized and moderated by Fred Dilla, Executive Director Emeritus of the American Institute of Physics and author of Scientific Journeys. Linda Dilla, former Public Information Officer at the Jefferson Laboratory and U.S. Department of Energy, and Colin Norman, the former news editor at Science. So with that, I would like to turn this over to Fred. So Fred, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hello to everyone in the Science and Society lecture series tonight. I'm sorry that my wife Linda can't join us. Colin and Linda and I just returned from 2 weeks in the Netherlands, and Linda and I have returned with a little plane flu. But we're very honored to have Dava Sobel here tonight. This is her second event that has been sponsored by the Lewis Library, as you heard from Rebecca. David was here during one of the history book festivals, talking about one of her other wonderful books, Longitude. And I highly recommend, if you haven't read today's book about Marie Curie, start with that and then go back to her list of remarkable, very well written, very entertaining books that teaches you about history and science. And the two that I'm most fond of are Longitude and Galileo's Daughter. But I believe this is Dava's 8th book, and I'm not going to waste any other time on this introduction, and I'll turn it over to David to talk about The Elements of Marie Curie. And it's a marvelous title because the elements refer to Marie Curie's one of her Nobel Prizes, where she discovered new elements, but it also talks about how she mentored 45 women scientists. Dava, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Fred. Thanks for welcoming me to this event. I'm going to show some pictures.
Yes, it's here.
You see her? Okay.
Yes.
So, since this is a science and society themed lecture, I thought I'd start by talking a little about my place in society and how I came to this story, because I'm late coming to the topic of women in science. I've been a science writer for more than 50 years, and most of that time I've been writing about men. But my previous book, which was called The Glass Universe, was all about a group of women astronomers at Harvard. And I was eager to talk about the discoveries they made, which are still relevant today. But what I really learned in the course of writing that book was something about myself. I discovered what I can only call a form of latent misogyny. I wouldn't think that as a woman I could be accused of misogyny. But what happened was that every time I learned some new discovery or methodology engineered by these women, I was surprised. I kept being surprised by what they had done. And that shouldn't have happened. So I had to admit to myself that despite my background, despite the fact that my mother was a scientist, I had never gotten any kind of, never felt any discrimination for being a woman writing about science. somehow I still had this very unfortunate attitude of surprise about women excelling in science. And then, even worse, I learned how not alone I was in that attitude. One of the people I had reading that book as a technical expert was a woman who was a professor of astronomy at Harvard. And she had the same reaction. She told me that she almost wasn't paying attention to the astrophysics that she was supposed to be monitoring because she was so gobsmacked by the women, and how even though she was at Harvard, she knew all their names, somehow she had always thought it was something cute or quaint. She hadn't realized they were actually doing science. So there it was again. And for me, it was like a religious conversion. All I want to do now is talk about women's stories in science. So my editor immediately suggested, why don't you write a new biography of Marie Curie? And I said, no, I don't want to do that. She's too famous. I'm looking for something else. And then I got asked to review a book called Women in Their Element, which was a collection of essays about women chemists. And of course, Marie Curie was one of the profiles. Her daughter Irene was another. But then there were numerous women in this book who had spent some period of time at Madame Curie's lab in Paris. And by the fifth or sixth one, it really started to sound like a network. And I got in touch with the Curie Museum, and sure enough, they told me that about 45 women had passed through her laboratory. Well, that was a story that I knew nobody knew. So that was how I landed on Madame Curie. Marie Sklodowska-Curie, her full name. And you can tell by her birth and death dates, she lived through an extraordinary period. I'm not sure that they show up on the screen. So 1867 to 1934. She lived through an extraordinary period in the history of science, really a second scientific revolution. So the periodic table was just maturing then. The idea of the quantum, special and general relativity, atomic or nuclear physics, radioactivity, all of these things were new, and she was in the thick of them. This year is the UN designated International Year of the Quantum. It's actually quantum mechanics that's 100 years old this year. The quantum is older, and we're going to talk a little bit about that right here. So this is a famous physics meeting that took place in 1911 in Brussels, and it was an invitation-only meeting, and all of the top physicists in the world were invited to this meeting. So here is Madame Curie, very busy in conversation with this gentleman who is Henri Poincaré, with whom she had studied math at the Sorbonne. This is Ernest Rutherford. Again, I'm seeing people in the Zoom, but right over here is Albert Einstein, and this gentleman is Max Planck, who came up with the concept of the quantum, the idea that energy is not continuous, but it occurs in packets. And that's much of what they discussed at this meeting. So these, I'm going to run through a few of these group photographs of these. It was called the Solvay Council, just to show that over the years, here she is in 1913, identifiable by her hat. It's kind of a Where's Waldo exercise. This would have been 1921. Here she is in a fox stole. 1927. There's still no other women in the group, and she is now seated between Max Planck and Hendrik Lorentz, who was the chairman of all of these meetings from the first one. Here's Einstein again. Niels Bohr is over here, one of the newcomers, Werner Heisenberg. Again, this was her community. So how did she get to be the only woman in all of those rooms? And she never wanted to be the only woman, as I hope I will convince you in this talk. So she was born in Warsaw, and her society, her Polish society, was completely out of favor by the time of her birth. Her family was culturally Polish. She was very proud of that heritage, but that part of Poland was under Russian domination, and she couldn't speak Polish in public. Most of the schools she attended, if they were private schools, she could speak Polish, but the state schools were all Russian only. And she was the youngest of 5 children. By the time this family portrait was taken, her mother had died of tuberculosis. One of her sisters had died of typhus, and her brother was at medical school. No tragedy, he was just absent from the photograph. And she was always interested in science and was always encouraged. Her father was a physics teacher, and thought that she really deserved an advanced education, which she could not get in Warsaw because women were barred from university study. So she and her sister Bronya made a pact. They would support each other. So first, Bronya, who was older, would go to Paris, to the Sorbonne, where women were admitted, and Marie would work as a governess and support Bronya's life in Paris until Bronya became a medical doctor and could afford to return the favor. Before that, they attended something called the Flying University, which was an underground, illicit form of advanced education for women, but there was no degree. So they carried out that plan, but once Marie got to Paris, she met Pierre. And then her goal of returning to Poland to educate her countrymen kind of fell by the way. And she tried to explain that although it would be a grief to her to remain forever in Paris, that's what she was going to have to do. And the opportunities for her to be a scientist were possible in Paris and not in Warsaw. And that was another reason she decided to stay. It wasn't only love, but love was most of it. So Pierre was a teacher at an industrial school, and as his wife, she was able to set up shop really in the school and do her experiments for her doctoral degree. So she'd earned 2 degrees that were like master's degrees, one in physics and one in math. But she wanted a doctoral degree in physics. And she was very interested in this new phenomenon, uranic rays, which she decided to study. And she theorized early on that these rays, which were emitted by just 2 known elements, uranium and thorium, that they were an atomic property of those elements, and that finding other substances that emitted those rays would be a way to discover new elements. And she began to suspect that one of the ores she was looking at contained a couple of as yet undiscovered elements. And this was very exciting. And Pierre dropped what he was doing to work with her on this project. And the work was so successful that it earned them half of the 1903 Nobel Prize in Physics. The other half went to Henri Becquerel for the discovery of what was originally called uranic rays, but which Marie renamed radioactivity. And they had worked in very primitive conditions. This is their laboratory. It was an old anatomical theater for medical students, and it was owned by the school where Pierre had taught, so it was available to them. But once they won the Nobel Prize and were instantly world famous, and people came to visit them from all over, no one could believe that this breakthrough research had been done in these pathetic quarters, which one scientist compared to a cross between a stable and a potato cellar. One of the reasons Marie was able to devote so much time to her work, even though she was a wife and a mother, was her father-in-law, who was widowed just about the time their daughter Irene was born. And he moved in with them, and he was a medical doctor. He was the perfect nanny, and he took care of the baby. And this enabled Marie to keep working. In our society today, this is exactly what every woman scientist needs, and almost none of them has it. In the United States today, about 40% of women scientists drop out when they have a child. Marie was also a teacher. Teaching was always crucial to her. She taught physics at an institution for young women who were planning to become high school teachers. And then in 1906, just 3 years after they shared the Nobel Prize, Pierre was killed in a ridiculous street accident, something that should never have happened. He was killed instantly, and she was devastated. She never really got over her grief, and by all rights, as a widow at 37 with 2 young children, her career should have ended with his death, but it didn't. Partly because the faculty, so Pierre by this point had been hired as a professor at the Sorbonne, and also elected to the French Academy of Sciences. So he was a leading figure in the French scientific community. And the faculty at the Sorbonne realized that she was the only person who was really qualified to take over the lab where they had worked together. And they offered her that position and Pierre's professorship, which she accepted. And that made her the first woman ever to lecture at that ancient university. So now she is not only world famous as a Nobel Prize winner, but she is the only woman in the world with this kind of scientific credentials. And that's how she became a magnet for other women who were eager to enter this interesting new field of science and wanted to come to Paris and work for her. So the first one was Harriet Brooks, came from Canada, and she had a lot of experience because she had been Ernest Rutherford's graduate student. So she had been in the radioactivity realm for almost as long as Marie Curie had. And she came to the lab and stayed only about a year, but she did really well. And Madame Curie had scholarship money now from Andrew Carnegie that she wanted to give to Harriet Brooks to keep her on. But Harriet suddenly got married and quit, and not only dropped out of science, but became convinced that women were constitutionally unfit for careers in science, and even lectured about that. The second woman came from Norway, and unlike Harriet Brooks, Ellen Gleditsch had no experience with radioactivity, but she was a very capable chemist. And one of the things they put her to work doing was amassing more radium by doing the chemistry work to break down the uranium ores and extract the radium. And Ellen Gleditsch never got married. She remained an active researcher the rest of her life, and she lived to be 88. So by this point, Madame Curie was a professor at the Sorbonne, so she was teaching at the high school, but she created a co-op school for her daughter and some of the daughter's friends. And this was the most remarkable school that ever was. So they got physics from Madame Curie, they learned chemistry from a chemist at the Sorbonne. They had art lessons at the Louvre, and they just traveled from place to place depending on where the teacher of the day was located. And one of the students had saved all her notes from Madame Curie's physics classes, and these were discovered decades later by a descendant who has published them. You can actually buy this book and see the handwritten notes about what she considered basic physics for adolescents. So in her very exalted position, some of her fellow physicists in France nominated her for election to the French Academy of Sciences. And there had never been a woman elected to any part of the Institute of France. So there was a lot of negative feeling about this female candidacy. Nevertheless, she was nominated, and she was not voted in. She lost out really by one vote, which really was an embarrassment for the Academy, because she was one of the world's experts on the topic. And by not being a member of the Academy, it meant she couldn't officially give her opinion on the value of certain research or nominate people for important prizes that the Academy awarded. So it was a very strange situation, not to mention that she was a foreign member of the national academies of many other countries. So she didn't say anything about it. She just kind of swallowed the slight. So that vote took place in January of 1911. Later that year was that first Solvay Council meeting. And just as everyone was coming out of that meeting, the news broke that Madame Curie, who had been a widow now for about 5 years, was having an affair with fellow physicist Paul Langevin. And this threatened to be a very ugly scandal. And right at that same time, the next week, she received word of her second Nobel Prize. This time, she was the only winner. Often the Nobel Prize is split 2 or 3 ways, but this time it was all hers. This was the prize in chemistry, the 1911 Nobel Prize in chemistry. And she was concerned about the negative publicity, and she asked the Nobel Committee if they really wanted her to come to Stockholm to accept. And they assured her that nobody believed the lies in the French press and she should come ahead. But then, with more publicity, they changed their minds and they told her not to come. And then she got angry. And she said that the prize was awarded for her scientific work, and she didn't see what any facts of private life had to do with it, and certainly not libelous, scandalous attacks on her character. So she showed up in Stockholm. Despite her 2 Nobel Prizes, even now, she is sometimes accused of not having really thought through this work. That somehow she was just Pierre's assistant, when in fact it was her project to begin with, and he joined her. But it doesn't matter, and this is the common fate of married women scientists who collaborate with their husbands. So this person, Hertha Ayrton, was married to a physicist, and they got around that problem by never collaborating. So they worked on different things, and there was no way that she could be considered her husband's assistant. And Hertha Ayrton was also a very active voice in the suffragist movement. Marie Curie was not. She was supportive, but she did not agitate the way Hertha Ayrton did. But Madame Curie interpreted the beginning of the First World War as a call to take what she knew about X-rays and create a mobile X-ray unit that she could drive, or have, she didn't yet know how to drive, that she could take to field hospitals, or as close to the front as they would let her get. And she did that, starting immediately with the outbreak of the war. And over the course of the war, wrote about her experiences. She was a wonderful writer. Her scientific papers are extremely clear, really a marvel of concise writing. And her letters are beautiful. She and her daughters exchanged letters constantly throughout their lives, and those have all been published. So in her X-ray work, she drafted her 17-year-old daughter to come along. Irene actually got a nursing degree, and during the summers, she would be stationed at a hospital by herself, teaching doctors how to perform X-ray examination, demonstrating its value. And because the two of them couldn't get everywhere, Marie created a course which was open to any French women who were citizens and at least 21 years old. Irene, of course, was younger than that, but she had a different category since she was helping to teach the course. And it was a 6-week crash course in electricity, X-ray theory and practice, and human anatomy. And at the end of the 6 weeks, you could go work at one of these outposts, and she trained 150 women to do that work during the war. And of course, they had employment long after the war, as X-ray diagnosis became more and more used. So always agitating for more better lab space, she eventually had an entire building, the Radium Institute, created because of her work and for her. So there were 2 buildings. One of them was hers for the physics and chemistry research, and the other one was devoted to medical and biological research, because very early on in the discovery of radium, it was clear that it burned their fingers. They wrote about that. Pierre even intentionally created a burn on his arm and reported how slow the recovery process was. And medical doctors had seized on that immediately, because if the material destroys tissue, then it could be used to destroy cancerous tumors. And that happened almost immediately. And by the end of World War I, radium really was the cure for cancer. And it burnished Madame Curie's reputation as a great humanitarian. So now she was a war hero for all that she had done during the war. And her name was synonymous with radium, which was the cure for cancer, and which got her invited to the United States to receive a gift from the women of America of a gram of radium, which cost about $100,000, and was formally presented to her at the White House by President Warren Harding. And as a result of that trip, she was prevailed upon to write her autobiography, which she really didn't want to do. But there was a lot of money involved in this potential book contract. And she agreed to write a biography of her husband with a brief sketch about herself tacked on at the end. So Irene, all this time, has matured and come to work in the laboratory. Eventually, she took it over and, like her mother, married her lab partner, and together she and her husband shared the 1935 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. And Irene was a little bit feistier than her mother in terms of the French Academy of Sciences, and she put her name in several times to be elected as a member, and it was no-go each time, in spite of all her accomplishments. So it was this woman, Marguerite Perret, who was the last person Marie Curie hired in her lab. She was a lab technician, and she was actively engaged in a project when Madame Curie died in 1934. But she went on working. She discovered a new element. She discovered the element francium. And then, since she had only a lab technician's education, she was encouraged to go to college and get a doctoral degree, and wound up being head of an important physics laboratory, and became the first woman admitted to the French Academy of Sciences in 1964. And even then, she wasn't really a full member. She couldn't vote. And that didn't happen till 1979. And that was a physicist named Ivan Choquet-Brucha. So Madame Curie had an exemplary life, but you might wonder, well, what is her relevance now? Why is she important now? And she's important now because in many ways she refuses to die. One of the most surprising things for me in the course of writing this book was the number of people who would say to me, that people always ask, what are you writing about? Oh, Madame Curie, oh, she's my hero. Or it's because of her that I went into science. And this is true of young girls now. And it staggers me that she functions to the extent she does as a role model, because studies of role models suggest that in choosing a role model, you don't want someone who's too accomplished, who's done things that you could never hope to do. And how can anybody top what she has done? Ginger Rogers used to quip about doing everything Fred Astaire did, but backwards and in high heels. But Madame Curie discovered 2 elements and won 2 Nobel Prizes. But it doesn't matter. And in trying to understand why that is, why she still functions as an inspirational figure to so many people, and not just women, not just scientists. And I think it's because of her humanity, her simplicity. She never really tried to capitalize on these discoveries. She always acted as though this was her duty, her pleasure, but also her duty. And because so many people were cured by radium or its byproducts, she had this reputation as a humanitarian. The real danger of radium was the farthest thing from her mind in the early days of her work. She wasn't really aware of how dangerous it was till the 1920s, at which time her lab instituted blood tests for all the employees, and anytime somebody's red blood cell count dropped below normal, they were told to take a few days off. But then they felt better and they came back to work because it was so interesting, it was so important. And they felt that the practices they put into place would be enough to protect them. In Madame Curie's case, it wasn't only radioactivity that did her in, but her tremendous exposure to X-rays, because during the war, she was working an X-ray machine in the room with the patient all day, every day, in a cotton smock. There too, just the effects weren't really understood. And even if she'd known the danger, I think she felt really called to do that work. So this is probably a good time to stop and have some questions. And I'll stop my screen share, although I do love this picture. Okay.
Thank you, Dava. That was a remarkable introduction to this great story. As you had mentioned, there are many biographies of Marie Curie, and you questioned yourself why you should do another one, but you have, in just 45 minutes, told us many new stories that justifies all of us reading this book. So we've got a few questions that let me ask. One of my colleagues here brings up an interesting parallel from your book, The Glass Universe. And the question is, in that book, you talk about many of the so-called computers, the people reading the glass photographs that were taken in the Harvard Astronomical Observatory. And one of them was born in Delaware. Annie Jump Cannon.
Annie Jump Cannon, yeah.
And so the question is, how would you compare Annie Jump Cannon's experience with Marie Curie's and her mentees?
Well, like Marie, she fully understood that women were capable of doing science, and she was very encouraging to the younger women at the observatory. She became interested in science as a very young woman. She went to Wellesley College, where she had really good astronomy instruction. And then she had this wonderful job at Harvard. And a few years ago, I got to visit her hometown of Dover and participate in a birthday observance of her. But I think a difference between them, I mentioned that Marie Curie really never got over her grief, and she was a very serious person, whereas Miss Cannon was known by everyone for being very jolly. And she might be the lecturer at the astronomy club meeting, but she would also bake cookies to bring. And that Harvard professor I mentioned earlier, the woman who is her name is Alyssa Goodman, so she is professor of astronomy at Harvard. And when she read the Madame Curie book, she said, Madame Curie just wasn't as much fun as your Harvard ladies. You know, my scientist friends and I, we get together. Yeah, we talk about science, but then after a while we say, "Oh, I really like your shoes," or something like that. Whereas Madame Curie she was just all business all the time.
So we have a question from one of our frequent listeners, Anne Finkbeiner. I'm sure you know Anne.
Mm.
Um, and
Oh,
she
I
asks,
do. Hello.
I'm interested in the extent to which Madame Curie hired women in her lab consciously, and if so, why would she have done that? You touched on that, but you can come back to it.
Yeah, well, she certainly was conscious of it. She hired many men too, far more men than women. But other places were turning women away, and she never did that, or not for that reason. More women applied than she could take, so she was fussy about who had recommended a person, were they really capable, but she was open to it. She didn't go looking for them, if that's what you mean.
Um, you had to do a remarkable amount of research to uncover this cast of 45 women that Marie Curie helped to train. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you did that and where you found the material and how you could trace these women's lives from their first contact with Marie Curie to through their careers?
Well, as I think shows in the book, not all of them are traceable. So shortly after the First World War, she created a position for a laboratory secretary and hired a woman who had been widowed during the war, whose husband had worked in the lab. And this woman, on her own initiative, began keeping records of all the lab employees. And that's how the women are known. So she would take some basic data about them, when they were born, where they came from, where they had studied, and as much information as she could put together, she did. And so the Curie Museum in Paris has all of those records. And I'm going to forget her name now. No, I'm not. I'm going to look it up because it's important to mention her name. She was so helpful to me. Someone has put together, I'm going to give you her name in a minute, what is left of those records. And that is most of the documentation. Some of these women, as I mentioned, were very famous in their own lifetime. So there is an entire biography written of Harriet Brooks and an entire biography of Ellen Gleditch. Natalie Pijard-Micot put together a book called Les Femmes du Laboratoire de Marie Curie. So it's just arranged alphabetically, each of the women, and as much as is known about them. So that was a major source. Then I had all of Marie's papers. I had the papers that some of the women had written. So Lucy Blanquier, who is one of the least known, she published a few things, including a handbook for physics students at women's, at the kind of school that Marie had taught at. So I had her book to quote from. Published papers and letters. So there are two books of letters between Marie and her daughters, and then there are just other letters in the files of the museum and the French National Library. And the amount of information that's available online is truly remarkable, including lab notebooks. For the year after Pierre died, Marie kept a journal of her grief, a handwritten journal in which she spoke to Pierre. And you can read the whole thing online.
We talked about this briefly before we went on the air, but we would urge any of you the next time you feel the need to go to Paris for any reason to stop by the Institute Curie. That building that Dava showed is still there, and it's been turned into a marvelous museum. And when Linda and I first went there 10 years ago, it was still slightly radioactive, and you couldn't go into her laboratory or touch anything. They took about 5 or 6 years to clean that up. But I think you might mention the problem with looking at some of Marie's papers with regard to early contamination.
Yeah, a lot of people talk about that. I was planning to go to Paris, of course, and then the pandemic happened and the lockdown, and I wound up not being able to go, which I thought would just ruin my chances of writing this book. But then I discovered how much was available online, and it turned out not to be an impediment at all, and I didn't have to worry about whether any of the materials were radioactive. And I had Madame Curie as my pandemic companion, my pod, which was terrific. Yeah, I still think about her attitude of dealing with adversity, which is so admirable. She never complained. She never wasted a moment moaning about how unfair things were. She just figured out a way to get around the obstacles and moved on.
Since the French Academy never did ask her to join, or her daughter and other Nobel Prize winner, Irene, the question is, how do the French celebrate Marie's accomplishments now?
Oh, she's very, very widely celebrated. Her remains were exhumed and moved into the Pantheon in the 1990s. So she was the first woman ever to be interred there. And she is widely cited as a French scientist, which the French like, but the Polish people are very upset about that because she did consider herself Polish.
Yeah. So you mentioned that when you showed the picture, Institute Curie, it's right in front of the Pasteur Institute. So the collaboration between those two laboratories actually can be looked at as one of the early foundations of medical radiation research, right? Even though
Absolutely,
she
yeah.
paid for it with her life, but she was very interested in the medical applications, and that co-location of those two laboratories was very important.
Yes, and the Pasteur Institute was the founding of that laboratory was a collaboration between the Pasteur Institute and the Sorbonne. And she had medical doctors in her family. Her brother and sister were both MDs, and her sister and brother-in-law created a tuberculosis sanitarium. So she was very interested in medical applications.
Yeah. We have time for one or two others. Here's one. Did you come across any documentation about how men felt about being in Marie Curie's laboratory?
Yes, and it's varied. So there There are a lot of very gossipy letters between Ernest Rutherford and Bertram Boltwood, who was an American radio activist at Yale. And they gossiped about all of the scientists they knew in common. And they were constantly taking pot shots at Madame Curie. They've just found her. I love the way Rutherford put it. He said, she has the advantages, but also the disadvantages of being a woman. But when you look at the people who worked for her, who were loyal to her all their lives, she was a good supervisor because she really pushed for the people who worked for her. She pushed for their recognition, for publication. She really gave them opportunities. Sometimes she would co-author something with a young person who was just starting. And when she got older and was the grand patron of that institute, she would just stop on the stairs every morning and chat with people. And the visitors called it the study of the science of radioactivity on the staircase.
Yeah. A follow-up from Anne Finkbeiner. She's wondering about the extent of what we think of Marie as a feminist. Was she seeing the applicants as women who needed a hand or as chemists and lab techs?
I think definitely as chemists and lab techs. Uh, yeah, she was not, she supported votes for women. She supported women's working rights, all of those things, but she wasn't actively campaigning for that. And she didn't go to pick out women specifically. But she was more than willing to give them an opportunity.
One last question, and I'm going to take the honor because I had the honor of inviting you here.
Thank you.
You mentioned briefly about her remarkable daughter, Irene, and her husband, who also Nobel Prize winners, remarkable scientists. Say a little bit about the other daughter, Eve, who wrote her first biography, but I think you have a nice statement in her about her connection to Nobel Prizes since she didn't get one in
Yes. Yes. So the younger daughter was not a scientist. She was artistic. She was a wonderful writer, and she started out as a concert pianist. And Marie was a very good mother in that regard because when she realized the other daughter was not going to go into the family business, she bought her a grand piano. But after Marie's death, Eve wrote the first biography of her, which is called Madame Curie, and which is really good, and remains the source for family letters in Polish, which the originals of those letters have certainly all perished in World War II. And that book won a National Book Award. So Eve used to joke that she was the only member of her family never to win a Nobel Prize. And then she married a French-American diplomat, Henri Lebouisse, who was the executive director of UNICEF. And she traveled with him and worked for UNICEF as an unofficial first lady for years. And he had to accept the Nobel Peace Prize for UNICEF. So she kind of got in on one.
That's good. Well, it's 6 o'clock, so we have to call it quits in this fascinating conversation. But for those of you who want to see it again, it will be on the YouTube channel of the Lewis Library in a few weeks, along with many of our other Science Society talks. And by all means, we urge you to purchase a copy of this wonderful book from our local independent bookstore, which is also our co-sponsor, Browse About Books. So I'm going to turn it back to Rebecca so we can have a little audience acclaim.
Yes, and we'd also like to thank our other co-sponsor, the History Book Festival. So thank you for their support as well. So as is our custom, if you would like to unmute yourself and applaud and say thank you, you are welcome to do so. So please join me in saying thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Right.
So much.
Thank you.
Yep.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
All right, everyone. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you next month for our next presentation.
right.
Have a good night. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.